Welcome back, listeners, to another episode of the BSB podcast. Today, we're shaking the tail feather with one of the recent shows to arrive at the Fisher Theater, Tina, the Tina Turner Musical, which was a bonus show in Broadway and Detroit's current season. Tina explored the life and legacy of the Queen of Rock and Roll. But before we dive into the show and the characters, please like, follow, and subscribe to us on all social media platforms at Boxy Babes. Spoiler warning, we are discussing the North American touring production of Tina, the Tina Turner Musical. So if you're wishing to avoid spoilers, then make like Proud Mary and roll on down the river. If you're still with us, let's continue on with the story and characters of this touring production. I sometimes crack myself up with these things that I write because I'm just like, how cheesy can I continue to get?
I mean, it's expected at this point. Like, it's no longer a surprise.
It's our calling card. So, RJ, we're going to just start off really, really strong. Did your family grow up listening to Tina Turner on the radio?
No.
Okay, that's fair. What is your earliest...
Grow up the radio, so
what is your earliest Tina Turner memory? Do you have one?
Really late in life. Literally when I was studying music in college. I mean, okay. I'm sure that I heard her music previous to that, but getting to actually know her as an individual happened during my collegiate days.
I mean, I feel like that's pretty on par for me. I'm going to be that basic ass bitch because I did not really know Tina Turner until October 12th, 2010, when Glee played River Deep Mountain High in their second season. And that was my first foray into Tina Turner's music. And I think that I was forever changed because that song to this day is one of my absolute favorites. There's just something about it that like, it gets in me and I just want to like sing my soul out. And so for me, that was really, it's maybe that's a typical gay experience, is that like Glee has opened up the door to so many people, but that was my first foray into this world of Tina Turner.
I mean, I know exactly what episode you're talking about. I for sure also saw that episode. I just don't think it just didn't connect with me. I mean, because all Glee was introducing new music, right? Or old music to a new generation.
Correct.
And so I didn't like do much recon on the individual artists that they were supporting or encompassing. But that, of course, that was the exposure.
I have to say, I don't even think I realized at the time that it was Tina Turner. I just knew that it was like two powerful women singing. Obviously, we have Mercedes and we have Santana. So for those that don't know, Mercedes is Amber Jones. Nope, that's not her name. What is her name? Come on.
Amber Riley.
Amber Riley. Her name was Mercedes Jones, and I just had the most ADHD moment of my life. And Santana was obviously played by Naya Rivera. Both that were just like divas of Glee. And so I knew that it was a powerful song, but I didn't necessarily know like who sang it. I think it took... my mom might have mentioned it. She watched Glee with me. It was definitely a passing thing that we did. We watched Glee until it ended, which is quite the struggle for anybody who has been in that shoes. Anything after season 3 was just a great letdown. But that was my first like, okay, Tina Turner, powerful voice. And it makes sense because they were both powerhouses. So when we're jumping into this, we're talking about specifically Tina, the Tina Turner musical, which is kind of a tongue twister. First off, but this is the story of Tina's life. General impressions. I know you're not a big biopic person. I know that you don't always like jukebox musicals. This is the best of both worlds. This is basically Tina's version of the Cher show, you know, or like the Temptations show. We've seen quite a few of them around here. What are your general thoughts?
Honestly, that actually was another reason that I mean, so I knew of her in college because I studied music. And so I had a music history class and had to learn about her. But then I also, as we've previously discussed, worked at a theater where national tours came through, and shows like The Temptations, like Beautiful, the Carole King musical, like all these biopics also came through and included like the commonality, which surprisingly in this one, the only other music, I mean, they mention a few other musical people. Um, they cross over a lot, um, where other shows include her not as even a feature or of any type, but just in the background of, hey, this was what was happening in the music scene at this time. Um, so I was like slightly familiar with what was going on. Obviously, there was a lot happening in the US specifically, that makes this story also unique just because you have like international crossover, but you also have that segregation piece still being a prominent storyline. So I actually distinctly remember that. And apparently, I also have seen this show before. So I'm not sure what it says that I didn't remember until we were literally sitting there that I had seen it before. Um, but a very, you learn so much about her life in this show, which I think it doesn't glorify anything. Like it's very true, I think, to her life, which is unique for this kind of show. I feel.
I do have to take you audiences members to the moment that RJ realized that he had seen the show, which was as the show was ending and we were clapping. He turned to me and said, "So I think I've seen this show." That was the moment. It took him all 2 hours and the encore to realize that maybe he had seen Tina, the Tina Turner musical.
Well, and really, it's the encore that made like that nailed it for me because I just remember looking at them feeling exhausted, and just as I was looking at them feeling exhausted. Uh, so yes, it was. I mean, because as we'll get into, spoiler, I think the ending is my favorite part. The encore is actually my favorite part. So
Which we will dive into quite a bit. So, but we're going to start at the beginning. So obviously, though, to start at the beginning of Tina, the Tina Turner musical, we have to start at the end of the show because it starts like a full circle moment where we are meeting Tina as she's about to get on stage, as she's about to give a performance, which we don't know that performance is Detroit. Obviously, every city is going to be different as she's touring, but she's meditating. And as she's meditating, she sees the call of like her grandmother and her father and her younger self, which pulls her back into her story, which I think is interesting because it does use kind of the same modality as like A Beautiful Noise, like
yeah,
where you're sitting there as an older artist of yourself, reflecting back on the life that you have had up until this point, which is a really, I think that's probably the easiest and most interesting way to have a frame story of a biopic of somebody's life. I can't even think of some of the other ones that do it. I know that the Cher Show doesn't. I can't remember how we got there or if we just jumped into it. Oh no, it starts with her being older and she reflects back. So like obviously must be the easiest way to jump into that story.
yeah, I know. Carol King does the same thing pretty much. She actually very similarly starts at a performance and then flashback, and then you meet again at that final performance. So this circular, very common for writing this type of piece.
And not just that, I'm going to ask you because you are a performer, you are an artist. There are times when you are probably on a stage and you're thinking about it. You're thinking about like, wow, look how far my journey has come. Look at where I started to where I began. Like this is, I started acting at 3 years old, like this is something that you've probably experienced at least once in your life while you're getting on stage, correct?
Yeah, I think, I mean, there are probably a handful of times that I have thought about that. A lot of the time you are still trying to like stay in the moment of what you're doing. But if you have, especially for people who do it for a living, like obviously I don't do it for a living, but for people who can basically do it in their sleep, there's enough headspace to kind of be like, be vocalizing or doing whatever you're supposed to be doing while you're alternatively thinking about that. Um, and reflecting or the words or whatever you're saying or singing or performing have a different meaning than maybe what they originally meant the first time that you did it.
And I do think that part of this has to also do with the fact, and correct me if I'm wrong, but Tina Turner was alive when the show came out. She passed away in May 24th, 2023. This show came out in like 2020-ish. She's an executive producer of the show. And so it makes sense that like as the artist is there and involved in the process, they're reflecting on their life. So like this almost feels like an easy, like I don't want to say easy, that's not true, but like um this feels like the most logical way is as someone's talking to you, like as the writer who wrote the book, Katori Hall was writing this, it makes sense to be like, okay, you're reflecting back to me a time where you started reflecting back. Like that makes sense. That's a really cool way. And then you don't have to explain, like, you don't have to start at the beginning and get there because even though you kind of do, like, I think it's a very interesting way to frame that story to get to where we need to go.
Yeah, well, and usually in that moment, you're immediately learning what's most or highly important to that person or that character, which in this case, and it was sprinkled all throughout, was of course her kind of religious, spiritual affiliations, um, and the themes that went along with why that was important to her.
Yeah, and I think along with that, if you really look at what happens, like, so we jump back to when I'm gonna guess about 5 or 6. I'm not quite sure how young she was in that opening scene, but she's sitting in church, and right we go from the gospels coming through her, like she kind of said, like she just feels it in her, to the person who represents the church, her father, beats her mom. Her mom leaves and abandons her, and she's left with her dad, who also abandons her. So here she is, feels the spirit of her religion, and then everybody abandons her, and she's all alone, and she's got nothing left inside of her. And when we see her next, she really is kind of a shell of a person comparatively. Which, so I think that is interesting that she goes back to that moment, because that's had, for any kid, that's a really formative experience, to lose both your mom and your dad, because your dad doesn't think that you look like him, and your mom thinks that he's evil, and that as a representation you are too.
Yeah, well, and it sets the tone very, very quickly in regards to character on from all perspectives because it's shocking. And I remember the women behind us immediately being like, "What? Like, is this real? Like, did this happen?" Um, because it was so brutal and honest, and it was not candy coated in any way. It was just, "I'm leaving. We're done. Goodbye. I don't want to see you." Which I feel like most pieces are a little bit softer. So I
Correct,
think
I
it's
would agree with that.
intentional, but also probably very real. Because otherwise, why would you write it that way? So I think she was staying very true to her experiences.
I always think it's interesting about biopics, because I remember seeing the Temptations one, and when I took Jordan, my friend Jordan, with me, because she loved the Temptations. She grew up on the Temptations with her parents, and when she was talking about it later, she goes, "Some of that felt super fabricated, because not only is one of the Temptations still alive, but the one that it follows is like very involved with the process." So there's one scene that we both we chuckled at a little bit, because he's like, "Drugs? No, I'll never do those." And I felt like just like a very much like a Hoyt, like, but like Tina Turner's musical, which she was involved in, was very much like we're starting off letting you know that like there was darkness. There was a lot of darkness. And I think what's interesting is that as you go through her life, it really shows you how she's, not only did she constantly come against that darkness, but she was struggling to find the light, even though she was portraying light to everybody else out in the world. She was portraying that she was a strong, female, like out there singing, a strong woman who was not giving it up, even though being a black woman in music was unheard of at the time. And so I think that it's really interesting that you start very, like you said, it's very raw. Like that beginning, it was almost jaunting how hard that hit.
Yeah, and for people who, and this is where art is so important, specifically theater, because first of all, probably a good 40% of the attendees for this production didn't know that. And it was like audibly, you could tell that they didn't know many, not just this item in the show, but many things. Um, and some of it is just because everyone's lived experience is so different, which like none of us are megastars, right? But as you said, like you're coming from different parts of the world. You're coming from different ways of upbringing. You're coming from different spiritual backgrounds. Um, and so the reality, bringing reality to people who may have never thought that that could ever be real is, I appreciate that because it's informing lived experience to those that will or have not yet experienced that.
And something that I love too about this is when you look at that story of Zelma, because that was her mother's name, Selma Bullock. She was she was cruel to Tina, or Anime, who that's how she was named to begin with. Like there was a cruelty to her. And even when Tina showed back up at 17, her mom was really cruel and really mean, but she was still showed that in a time where it was impossible to be a single mother, a divorced single mother at that, she did it. And then they show it happening again with Tina and Ike, which I knew a little bit about the Ike saga of her life. I wasn't as familiar. Again, I didn't know a lot about Tina Turner because she didn't, not that she shied away from it, but also I feel like it wasn't out there a lot, or at least it wasn't talked about a lot, other than the fact, like I was telling my mom today, and she goes, all she knew that Ike was just like a mean motherfucker, was basically her words. Like he was a mean, cruel man, but she fought against him in the end too. And it showed that not only did one generation of, like do this, but two generations showed that you can be strong and capable. And I think that is that's such an important takeaway of the story, that I hope that resonates with a lot of people as they see it, that like, if Tina Turner can do it, if Zelma can do it back in what, the 40s, that we can also maybe rewrite our story here and not have to settle for something like an abusive husband or a situation that is less ideal. And so I think that there's a beauty in that part of the storyline, and why I think that the story is so important.
Well, and it's so interesting. I immediately think of the parallels between this and Carole King and her uh, husband. I think of why am I blanking on it? There's another musical like Cher. It made
Correct.
less extreme, right? But we all in Stardom we see over and over again the man kind of leading the relationship and balancing or leveraging his fame or experience or the fact that the discovery of said female for the rest of forever. And so, and then luckily, then out of those bad situations, we get these powerhouse women, which it's very interesting that it is exactly that. I mean, we have these women who we would never think would falter ever. Um, but as this musical showcases, like she was with him for what, 16, 17 years
Yeah.
before finally like cutting it out. And that was primarily due to her family, or her children. Um, but sadly, I mean, I feel again like Stardom and the time frame, that was very like you would never be discovered as a woman in music, and music still today is still, I mean, we've come a very long way, but at that time, like it was a man's world, as it was for many things, but it was these were just like the first people barely getting in, let alone a person of color. But yeah, I'm always astounded.
I think that's something of that's really telling too, is when we look at, and granted, we're not talking about the music part of this, but when you look at the development of River Deep Mountain High in that moment, I always knew that it was like considered like a duet between Tina Turner and Ike Turner. But to learn that he wasn't even in the room when it happened because they didn't want him, they wanted Tina. And I thought like, but his name still got on there. You know what I mean? And people still like they were known as a pair because she was a woman that did, like, again, and at that time period, that was, it was barely like Ike was gonna barely get through the door, let alone just Tina. And the fact that they took a chance at Tina, but he still got to be on there because he was the man. I was just like, what? Like, again, we've come so far, we still have so far to go, but like that was just a moment I'm just like, what? That is just like it's hard to kind of see that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and you think, and I always think of her management shifting and change, um, and the friendships that developed because of that. Like I mean, obviously wasn't insanely talented, but it is just crazy. You can only imagine, like, these women were like fire, right? Which is the analogy that they use in this show a lot. Think of the ones who couldn't or didn't stand up for themselves and how much talent got buried because they weren't men. It's
Correct.
crazy.
And when you think about it, as her story goes on, so she eventually does leave Ike, but there's also a suicide attempt there. Like she like decides to like give up on life. She makes it through. She leaves him. I think there was another child in between there. I think that's how the storyline went. So she has another child and she eventually leaves him. And for 5 years, she can't get work other than Vegas. Like it truly shows you how much power Ike had over her. And like, I did like that they showed all that. And then they really show the triumphant return of who she was, though it took changing everything about her and almost losing herself to do so, which again, I think just shows how much extra work it takes as a Black woman at that, like at any time, but specifically that time, to do anything to be seen and recognized as pure talent. Because there's no doubting that Tina Turner is one of the best vocalists that we've ever had, and she still for 5 years had to do Vegas shows and clean houses and stuff at the end of the day to make her bills.
Yeah, and even like age wise, like there's so many things happening, right? There's misogyny, there's ageism, there's it's just like a lot. Like because if ultimately if you weren't like some tiny little white girl who maybe is like 19 or 20 and breaking into the circuit, um, you're not gonna get a call from a producer or a record company. Um, and as we learned through this production, there was still such blatant hate happening that wasn't even trying to be hidden. Uh,
No.
and I just the situations that they were put in, I distinctly remember actually from the first time that I saw this. Once I saw it again, I was like, oh yeah, the scene at the hotel where they had to pay for a hotel that they didn't stay at, um, and then almost got into kind of a shootout with the cops because they go to reach into their pocket, right? I
Right.
mean, unfortunately, some of these systemic issues are still occurring today. Um, but to think that these were, again, people of their time who had their faces plastered on magazines and were on TV and radio, and yet still they were being treated like dirt, essentially.
Yeah, which is it's just super telling, and it's a great that they showed this. But let me ask you this as well: with like things like the racism, the suicide attempts, the amount of physical violence that was on here. Why do you think that they include things like this in a show? Like, do you think that it's to humanize Tina Turner, or do you think it's to show a story that is universal to everybody? Which maybe those are the same thing, and I'm splitting hairs here.
Well, knowing that Tina was a producer on this, I feel like obviously she, at the end of the day, had the call on what was in, what was out, and how it was being presented.
Sure.
Um, I think it is absolutely intentional because, again, when else are you going to learn about it? And we have this really bad tendency in history books to paint things over in a more beautiful light than what they were. And so, I mean, even from reading about her in music history, I wasn't learning about the racism, right? Or if I was, it was in a very light kind of way because chances are who wrote that textbook or like from what lens
Hmm.
was that textbook written. Um, and so I think the intentionality of having these things in the show reminds us and tells people this was real life. Like this was the lived experience of these people and this is what we had to go through to get to where we were, and it wasn't like the stardom, it wasn't glamorous, right? We learned that she was broke, that she had no money. She didn't have anything to her name because Ike basically took the rights to everything. And then when she went to court and fought for just her own name, she had nothing because all of the music was under both of their names. Um, so yeah, I think it is very dark, but I think it's just telling the truth. Like it is speaking truth to the historical piece of her existence.
And I do agree with you. I think that this is one of those things where I think it does humanize her a little bit, but I also think that it truly showcases just the type of life that someone as big as Tina Turner lived. Because believe it or not, I took a history of rock and roll class at Wayne State because I just needed a credit. And there's a whole chapter on Tina Turner and how she revolutionized music, but it doesn't talk about the abuse. It doesn't talk about the racism. It talks about like she grew up in the South. She found her voice because of Ike Turner. Her and Ike Turner had a great career. And then she went solo. And like, that's literally the narrative that they were saying in this book. And it reminds me of the saying that I learned back in high school that the winner is the one that gets to dictate history. And I think that this was her way of being like I won. I won my own story. I won my own chapter, but I'm also going to tell you exactly what that is because it doesn't just it's not an easy ride to stardom. It's not an easy ride to be somebody who had to live through history. And granted, we all are living through history. We're still living through history. Sometimes it's a little too much history going on at one time. But this is truly like, I think this was her way of saying that, look, mom, I won. Because I want to go back to that scene with her mother where she's at the hospital with her mom and Ike shows up and her mom's just like, just forgive him. He's changed. He's a good guy. And she still had to, in the face of her mother dying, be like I'm the first and only person that seems to respect me here. And I think that this was her way of also the Tina Turner musical was the way for Tina Turner to show I respect myself enough to tell you guys the good and the bad, and it doesn't change who I am.
Yeah, because equally, she's not always perfect either, right? But that transparency makes you appreciate and understand, the historical perspective makes you understand why basically that whole second half happens, and why she approaches her family the way that she does. Um, but yeah, the family relationships are very interesting, as they lean into, when her mother passes away and the conversations around her sons and how ultimately she's not there for them as much as her family thinks that she should be. But of course, if you have to pay bills, how do you balance that? If you don't have furniture or if you're selling furniture to be able to live in a house, um, that is the trade-off between spending time with bringing up your sons or making sure they have somewhere to live.
So with a show like this, it seems like we really appreciate some of the heavier topics that they explore. We're really appreciative that we're having those conversations. But when you're looking at one person's life and you're trying to cover a long life, a lot of years, do you feel like there's almost too much exposition going on? Because this, I think, what I struggled with was that there was a lot of story and there was a lot of I feel like sometimes there could be the thing with the story for me is that it could be shortened just for clarity. I don't know if that makes any sense. I know this is a person's real life, but I'm wondering does it suffer because we're covering so much of a person's life?
Yeah, well, and I think there were scenes that were dragged out that we got what the point was, right? I think there was a sequence of just doing drugs hardcore for a good minutes. I mean, it kept going. On top of the fact that even from upon meeting him, we already knew that that was a problem. And so did we need to sit through a song and a half, 2 songs of him just straight up doing drugs and nothing else was really happening? Probably not. But again, that was clearly so important to what they wanted to showcase, which I would have been very interested in hearing what Ike,
Thought of
the
that?
family, how that was interpreted when this show came out, because he is painted, I mean, righteously in a very, very bad light. And
Yeah,
so I'm just curious, like, I mean, to include him, you have I don't know if he ended up having any other family, but um, yeah, this show just isn't
it's
good for
interesting.
him.
It's interesting because he did pass away in 2007, and it looks like the only person was his son. And so I wonder, like, what happened? Like, was the son a part of this? Like, was he? Then again, Ike Turner was married 14 times, so like, there might have been a wife there at some point at the end.
Yeah. See, and that's what I'm like. There's no way, like, based on even what is shown in the show, which I mean, comparatively to that, sounds like there was even more going on. So maybe they did slim it down, but this is just all they could afford to show, to justify the amount that was going on. They had to at least have that much time.
Sure, and it makes you think because he had 6 children too. So it makes you really wonder, like, what,
Like
like,
historically, how do they feel about this? Because they would be probably. I mean, what? I guess it depends. If you had that many marriages, you could have kids of all ages.
sure.
Um, but also, if you knew, like, history repeats itself. So I can't imagine that their experience with him as a father, and somebody can totally correct me if I'm wrong, if he had like a revelation and became a great dad. But based on what we saw on the show, that wasn't the case.
So it's interesting because his last wife, Audrey Madison, wrote in her memoir "Love Had Everything" about how he had bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, and how writing the book was a way of cleansing and releasing all of the trauma that her and the children had. So it makes me think that they, by the point that it came around, everybody might have been on board and just been like, we don't have to hide. And granted, they don't talk about that. They don't talk about his mental health issues. Like, you can assume as much as you want, but they don't really discuss that. And I think that that's interesting that that part's left out of there. But I guess from Tina's point of view, that didn't matter to her story anymore because her story by that point was she was away from him.
Right. And at that point, there's a difference between having some issues occurring and your ability to address them and change, which it sounds like. I mean, at the very end, right at that deathbed scene, the perceived opportunity for him to change, and then he decides not to apologize,
I,
which I'm sure was a very defining moment because they included it. I'm sure it was a very defining moment for that.
I loved that scene when he just like handed her the note and she knew in that moment he was incapable of actually apologizing. And I think that like sometimes as a psychologist, we have those moments where you're sitting in a room with somebody or that you're watching a couple sit in a room together and you just look over and you realize that the other person the promise of the apology that they've been waiting for is just never coming and it finally dawns on them. And so to me that I feel like that's always like a turning moment of like this is truly when the healing begins. You know what I mean? Like that's the moment that we accept the fact that whatever we were waiting for all those years is just never coming.
Right. Right. Like this is reality.
Sure. So before we run out of time, obviously I want to talk about the performances. So this is the hard part of kind of a biopic like this, because I feel like there's such an insurmountable job for these actors because you're modeling somebody, your performance after somebody, you have somebody to base this on. But you also have to base your performance off of somebody. Like, so I feel like this is one of those things, and correct me if I'm wrong. I don't know if you've ever played any, like in a biopic before, but like, I feel like that'd be really hard because you're both shoehorned into an exact part and also trying to not do wrong by the people who are alive.
Right. Yeah. Luckily, as far as I can remember, I have not had to do that. But it is quite a conundrum because also the expectation, it is basically that you are that person. And so it's not even that people are judging your talent anymore. It's that they're judging, can you embody the expectation of this person? Especially with someone who just like recently passed, because she was touring for so much of her life. Like some people who attend this show could have seen her live. And so now you're literally, even though it doesn't make any logical sense because they're obviously two different people, and it's not an impersonation show, but it kind of is, because the expectation is that you're going to look like, sound like, be like Tina, but really you're literally not. You're physically not at all.
I will say this about this too. Like, I think that impersonation is a good word, and I'm gonna categorize this as different things. I feel like for a lot of people, like they go to Vegas when they see Elvis, and they know it's not gonna exactly be like a good Elvis. But like when you're going to see like a Broadway quality show, and you see somebody on stage, you are expecting that person to be on stage. When we went and saw the Cher show, the adult Cher sounded and acted just like the Cher that we know. Through makeup and costumes, she looked like the Cher that we know. And so I think that that is like really a, like I said, an uphill battle. But I will say this about our Tina Turner, Darlene Bertley, the people next to us, on my side, on my left side, when she did Proud Mary right before the ending of Act 1, the one girl said, "That's Tina Turner." Like she like in that her mind, that was the embodiment of Tina Turner. And truly, I guess that's the point where she really does become the Tina that people know and that they really that they can remember in that moment. Um and so I feel like that is like a slam dunk in a way for Bertley, because she, if somebody in the audience can go, "That's Tina Turner," she's done her job.
Yeah. Yeah. If people are questioning, which sometimes I have found myself doing that at shows where those folks are still alive, is you're like, wait, like, no, that's not them. But it is so close to them. Which again just goes to the level of talent that is out in the ether, because it just like to emulate another human being and make it good. It's another Tina Turner, right? Like
For sure.
there's no one that can truly be Tina Turner, but you can dance like her, you can sound like her, like it's just it's next level in my opinion.
I will say this, that I did not know, like I didn't know early Tina Turner. And like I was like, okay, Bertley's a really good actress. She's a really good singer. Is this Tina? And I think it was during River Deep Mountain High when the guy's like, "No, give me more." And like all of a sudden she had that growl, and I was like, "Oh, that's distinct." I think that's one for me. I was like, "That's distinctly the Tina that I have in my head. Like that's distinctly the person I knew." And in that moment, I was like, "Oh, that is that is Tina. That is a really good Tina up there." And I think this kind of leads into the part two that we had talked about, because there's a Tina alternate. And so I looked it up. I did some research for you, RJ. I know you love Recon. So it is split. It's been split pretty much since the beginning, because, quote unquote, every actress typically performs 4 shows per week, because the show is so physically and vocally demanding that it requires a unique combination of vocal range and explosiveness. And so that's why on that sign that we had outside, we were just like, oh, they told us which Tina we had, which was the main one. But truly, this is a part that is split between 2 people because it's so difficult to do.
Well, and there's not one scene, like I don't think she leaves the stage aside from maybe a costume change, which also we'll talk about this in episode 2, but shout out to the costume crew. She literally is either always singing, always speaking, always dancing. Like collectively out of that, what, 2.5 hour show, I think maybe was not on stage for a totality of 5 minutes, maybe, which is absurd.
I will say that maybe the beginning part when she was younger, but within 5 to 10 minutes, she is on stage again as a teenager, which is crazy. I do want to talk about as well before we wrap this up, the Raymond Earl King, but specifically the Ike Turner, Raymond Earl King, and then their counterparts. Because in the moment I thought so, but I think it's such a cool idea that they had Lamar Burns, who plays Raymond Earl King, and Monty Kane, who plays Ike Turner, play the sons, who are the sons of those stars in real life. Like, what a cool way to utilize your cast, but also to make the callback to what her dad says in the beginning of like, I don't see you when I see your look in your face. And then to have the 2 people a little bit later when she had the second baby, they said, "Oh, you can see Ike in that face." And then to have those actual people play those roles was super, super smart. And also shout out to Lamar Burns, who just had an incredible vocal range as Raymond. But I just thought it was such a cool callback. Did you pick up on them playing those same roles in the show as we were there?
Yeah, at first I thought it was a little bit daunting. I don't know if that's the right word, but I was like,
Sure.
oh, how kind of like literally bizarre to have clearly full grown men playing, teenagers, I think is what they were supposed to be. And
Yeah.
but then it does make sense. Like you're like, oh yeah, but their faces, like there's this big, and it, of course there is. Like when you have a kid and you look at them, and how many times do you say, "Oh, your dad's eyes," or your mom's nose," or whatever that is. And so, and it got brought up intentionally, as you just mentioned. So I think, yeah, it was very good writing and a good callback.
Absolutely. I think when you said that, I thought of Harry Potter, where they make a big deal about the eyes and then they didn't do it well in the movie. And like, you really truly need those. Like, that makes sense. Like, you're doing a show, you already have these actors in a role. Don't just have them be a part of the ensemble, have them be an essential part of that story, even though you're right. It was a little daunting when you saw the teenagers be fully grown men and you're like, that just feels a little weird because you already have kids in the show and you have more kids. But once you kind of get that connection of how it all goes together, it truly does make the connection. So overall, I think that the takeaway from this is that the story is, and I used this in the post I did last night, it's a story of strength and resilience. And I think that's truly what stands out about Tina Turner's story. And the characters that we have in the show is that, like, it's all about just like when life throws you a curveball, how do you respond to that? And for Tina, it was constantly finding the light. And that's what the Tina Turner musical is all about.
Great.
And so on that note, we are running out of time. However, stay tuned for part 2 of our the Tina Turner musical. Thanks again for joining us here in our box seats. Until next curtain call.